Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Jigesa washing station, wash processed Ethiopia from Exposure Therapy Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Exposure Therapy, based out of Singapore. And this is their fourth ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Baragua Thimu AB, a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that when we were placing our order with Airworks, we essentially told them to pick out whichever two coffees were the most popular from Exposure Therapy, and these were the two coffees that they picked out. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 59. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the same as our previous Exposure Therapy review, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. However, we also went more fine on the grind for this one as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, once again, from our previous Exposure Therapy review, we mentioned that they do roast on the very light side of things in comparison to a lot of the contemporaries around them. And I can say that this coffee is certainly no exception, as a lot of people do throw out the term ultralight for coffees like this, and I can definitely say that that is the case with this one, given some of the very light characteristics to it. So I'd mentioned that there's only one Asian coffee roaster I can think of off the top of my head that consistently roasts lighter than Exposure Therapy, so hopefully that gives you a good idea. Very light coffee. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 32, first impression through the V60, and that was honestly my first impression of this coffee, was that it was notably light. It was reminiscent of the other Exposure Therapy coffees that we'd had, in part largely due to the delicacy and the tea-like experience that it was offering, as there was a lower level of intensity and a lighter body with a mostly citric-forward feel to it. This one definitely felt like it needed a little bit more time, even in comparison to the Baragua Thimu that we had also reviewed from them. Day 35 through the Chemex, and the coffee was a little bit better today, as there was a nice combination of some honey and black tea qualities that were a little bit more similar to the experience that we had with the Heza Hills coffee from Exposure Therapy earlier this year, as the coffee does continue to present in a lighter but clean tea-like sense, as it still feels like this coffee is opening up with time. And this gives me a great opportunity to clarify some of the things that we had said in that Baragua Thimu review, as I had mentioned that it was a Rwandan coffee, but it was actually a Burundi coffee, so I got that completely wrong. But what's been a little bit interesting to me is, maybe with a slight exception to the Cantaranas, which is the washed Colombian coffee that we'd reviewed from Exposure Therapy, all of them have had this kind of interesting honeyed characteristic, this tea-like characteristic to them. It's been consistent in all three of the other coffees that we reviewed, and I can see maybe a little bit from that Cantaranas, but I have no problem with it. I do think that it gives a very distinct feel to a lot of the Exposure Therapy coffees, as this one was also one that offered that characteristic as well. Day 38 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee is the best it has been to this point, as it's offering the most intensity, as it feels like this coffee is finally on the initial stages of opening up with a little bit more of a fresh fruit feel in a stone fruit-like sense. Listed red fruit qualities do feel a little bit more apt, as there's a subtlety to them. And let's talk about the descriptors on this coffee. As going into it, I was very curious to see a lot of red fruit qualities listed on the notes for this coffee, as it's not too often that you have a wash processed Ethiopian coffee that skews in these directions. Now, if you have a natural, that's very common. However, seeing that was interesting to me, and I was very curious to see how it would translate to this coffee. And as you can see from some of the earlier experiences, I haven't really found any of the strong or prominent red fruit qualities, and going forward is going to be interesting to see if that was the case, given that this coffee was finally starting to open up a little bit more. Day 41 through the V60 with the higher extraction adjustment, 17:1 at 99 degrees Celsius, and the coffee wasn't quite as impressive as the previous days, as it really seemed to accentuate a lot of the tea-like qualities and characteristics to it, with a little less of the fresh fruit characteristics as well. Otherwise, it's been expectedly light and clean, and to an extent, that's been a little bit of a sticking point. However, on day 44, we would opt for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was by far the best it had been to this point, as it definitely felt like this coffee was improving with time, but this was finally the standout experience that we did have for this coffee, as it had excellent cleanliness to it and plenty of intensity for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, as there was an abundance of fresh fruit characteristics. Now this time I can see much more of a stone fruit like sense to it, but Also, it can be spun to being reminiscent of a lot of the listed red fruit qualities on here. So they do have, I want to say, cherry, strawberry, and it always felt like it was going to be a little bit of a stretch for me to find that on this coffee. And it's entirely possible that I did prime myself into believing that these were qualities that were present within this coffee. However, one thing that stands out about it is that there's a very slight and interesting tartness to this coffee, which I can see is maybe a little bit of an unripened strawberry, maybe a little bit of an unripened cherry quality to it, but it is very fresh fruit forward regardless. So I can still spin it into those characteristics, as I don't necessarily think that the sweetness of those qualities were maybe what we were looking for in this coffee. I do think that it was maybe just a little bit more of that slight tart feel that is common within this coffee at times. Day 47 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is still nice, but not quite as impressive as some of the recent days, as it feels like this coffee definitely benefited from being pushed, as it does have still plenty of the fresh fruit characteristics, but it's still otherwise skewing that slightly tart red fruit sense with perhaps a little bit more intensity overall in comparison to the earlier days. However, we just found better definition to the days that we pushed this coffee. Day 50 through the Chemex with our standard recipe. And the coffee is nice yet again, as it does feel like it needs to be pushed, as it's still skewing that slight red fruit tartness with some fresh stone fruit and melon qualities as well. So an abundance of fruity characteristics throughout this coffee, and on day 53, we opted for the Chemex with our higher extraction adjustments one more time, and the coffee was back to being at its best, which was interesting for me given that's the experience that we had with the Kenyan coffee that we reviewed from them as well. The more we pushed these coffees, the better results we did seem to get, as it did have just a little bit more sweetness than the average Ethiopian coffee and a very fresh fruit forward experience, extremely reminiscent of what I would describe as a fruity black tea, which is also kind of interesting given the majority of the other coffees we've had from them. I also describe as being pretty reminiscent of tea in a number of ways. Outside of that, there's a bit of jasmine, some of the tart red fruits once again, stone fruits, and a fair bit of lemongrass as well, giving it some citric depth. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those. We will start with the cleanliness level 4. Starting with that, I do have to say that it is still on the higher side of level 4 for a washed Ethiopian coffee, as obviously going into a washed Ethiopian coffee, you are expecting it to be pretty clean, and the only exceptions we usually get are the ever so rare washed Gesha that scores that level 5. But now this one's on the higher side of level 4. I found that there was excellent definition, especially to the fresh fruit qualities and characteristics of this coffee, so very happy with the way that that played out in this one. Finish level 4. Finish is kind of interesting given that that's where a lot of the fruits come through more so than right off brew, as you can feel that it is, again, a little bit more tea-like, so you can get a little bit more of a savory tea characteristic at the time, but the way that this coffee finishes is very pleasant and very even, so that's why that's scoring there at that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. And I mentioned in that Brogwe theme we reviewed that this is one thing that I really want to discuss a lot in this coffee. I don't think that this is the focus of this coffee. I don't think it was ever intended to be a particularly sweet or intense coffee in that regard, but it still did score above average when it comes to a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, which was one of the most important parts of this coffee for me, as if it didn't reach that level 4 mark, then this still would have been a nice coffee, but I do think that that added to just how much I enjoyed it. So massive credit to them on that one. I do find that that was one of the most important parts of this coffee for me. Florality level 4, I mentioned a slight bit of a jasmine-like quality to this one, so that's why we scored it as high as it did. We'll go ahead and move on to the berry fruit level 4. And just out of curiosity, I do believe it was something like fresh strawberries or fresh cherries, red grape, and strawberries. So yeah, a number of berry fruit characteristics to this one. And I can definitely see a little bit more of that grape characteristic at times, but berry fruit was going to score there at level 4. I don't know if it's a priming effect, being completely honest, because there is just that slight tartness to it, which I can see reminiscent of all of the fruit qualities they have listed on there. So that's why we did score it at level 4, regardless of whether or not it was as well defined as a lot of the notes might indicate. Stone fruit level 4, for me, I would say that that was a much more clear representation of the fruits within this coffee, as early on I was thinking a little bit more along the lines of that traditional Ethiopian stone fruit quality to it, and the more we continued to work with this coffee, the more of the peachiness I was able to experience. So that's a little bit more justified there at the level 4 that I can say for me personally. And then a couple of level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee. Nice little contrast to the Kenyan coffee that we reviewed that scored to level 5, as I could definitely see a pretty significant difference between the two of these coffees. Citrus fruit level 4, mentioned a slight lemongrass characteristic. Could be a number of things. Could be just the natural results of a coffee like this, or it could be the profile that exposure therapy opted for. But regardless, it gave it some citric depth, some more of the fruit qualities in this one. And then the final thing we're discussing, savoriness level 3. I'd mentioned before that it continues to be pretty consistent with the experiences I have with exposure therapy, being a little bit more tea-like than a number of other coffee roasters that we do review. You can definitely see a more savory black tea quality within this coffee, and that's why we scored that there at the level 3. Final thing worth discussing, body level 2. Definitely a lighter bodied cup of coffee. Fully expected a washed Ethiopian coffee brewed through the Chemex, but it still had at least a little bit of texture to it. So outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what we are getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. You know, we've actually had really good results with exposure therapy all around. Usually I like to reserve our favorite coffee from a set of coffees that we're reviewing for being last. And that was the case with this coffee, as it's not going to be really surprising to anybody that I preferred the washed Ethiopia to the washed Kenyan coffee, but both of the coffees were really nice, which goes along with our previous experiences. I did like Heza Hills once we were able to kind of work through and get that coffee to its best. And I definitely enjoyed Cantaranas. And I think if I'm discussing all 4 of these coffees side by side, that Baragwi Thimu was probably my second, and this is probably my favorite of the coffees that we've had from exposure therapy, which is nice given that we had already had positive results from them earlier. Now, if anybody's curious in exposure therapy, I do believe that the person that's running exposure therapy is on a little bit of a break right now, so it might be difficult to get their coffees as of this moment. Don't quote me on that. A lot of things could have changed by the time that we released this review, but outside of that, I'm going to keep an eye on them. Again, a lot of people have requested that we review more of their coffees, so they do seem to perform very well with the coffees that they are releasing, and as a result, we will definitely be keeping our eye on what other releases they will have, especially if Airworks does bring them back in the future. I have a person I would suggest this coffee to. I'm going to go back to the profile of this coffee, given that it's very, very light, and it's very, very tea-like in a number of ways. But outside of that, it does have really nice intensity for a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, and I do need to highlight that because usually one of the things that's going to leave me disappointed about Ethiopian coffees is a lack of intensity. Now for me, I did need to push this coffee, but we were well rewarded when pushing this coffee, as there was so many of those fresh fruit qualities and characteristics in all of the fruit aspects, citrus, stone, and berry fruit, so that afforded this one plenty of depth with plenty of intensity and an excellent level of cleanliness. So that's kind of the best direction I could point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Jigesa washing station, wash processed Ethiopia from Exposure Therapy Coffee. Thanks for watching.